When Australians voted overwhelmingly for same-sex marriage, the government promised a separate review into religious freedom in the country. It was completed 4 months ago, but has not been made public as yet. Leaked details, though, in Fairfax newspapers today suggest there will be a push to make it easier or perhaps less contested. It's a bit unclear for religious schools to be able to discriminate on the basis of sexuality and gender when it comes to accepting teachers and students as well. Joining me live now is the Liberal MP Tim Wilson to discuss this more. Tim Wilson, thanks very much for your time today. What's your understanding, first of all, on what this push is all about, what it could entail?
Well, I haven't actually seen the report or read the report, but I think it's important to understand what's current law in Australia today. Under the Sex Discrimination Act, you can actually, religious schools and institutions or organisations established for a faith-based purpose are exempt from anti-discrimination laws in terms of employment and hiring for permanent employees and contract labour, as well as for who can go to schools based on a number of conditions, including sexual orientation, gender identity, pregnancy, etc. If you actually go and look based on what was in the report in the paper today, it says that we should keep the existing law but actually narrow the definitions and the basis in which people can discriminate. So it's been written up as though it's this massive exploration. In fact, it's the opposite. It's a narrowing. And when I say people need to take a chill pill, one of the reasons I say that is because one of the authors is the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Rosalind Croucher. Now, obviously, I have had some experience working at the Australian Human Rights Commission. As a Human Rights Commissioner, every proposal is considered and goes through in depth. Ultimately, this is an independent report, and what everybody should be waiting to see is what the government's response to it is.
That's absolutely true, and we are waiting with bated breath, Tim Wilson. On what you just said, so your understanding and narrowing, what sort of narrowing are we talking about? Well, if it's based on what's in the paper today, it would be narrowing it to remove pregnancy and also intersex status. It would also require that organisations that wish to discriminate actually have to be upfront and publish it. At the moment, they don't have to be. They don't have to give any grounds or any detail about what they plan to do. So it would actually mean that people who went to schools, whether through employment or through wanting to be educated there, including parents, would have knowledge prior and in advance, and then that would inform their decision-making. Right, and if out of this there is a push to actually go the other way, make it easier, for example, for children to be excluded from schools on the basis of their gender, for example, or their sexuality, would you countenance that at all? My view is quite clear on this, which is I won't be supporting any new laws that do so. As I said, I'll wait and see what the government's response is. I'm not expecting a response to expand the grounds in which the government permits discrimination against people on a basis of a whole host of factors, but we will wait and see. Where's that going to leave people that wanted this review, Tim Wilson, to presumably go the other way when they were concerned about religious freedom after same-sex marriage was passed in Australia and voted for by Australians?
Well, the basis of this report was to address broader concerns than just marriage, same-sex couples and its interaction with religious freedom. It was about the state of religious freedom in Australia today. And I make no apology, I am very hardline in support of freedom of religion. I always have been. It's one of the foundational principles of liberalism. But there's a difference between freedom of religion and religious freedom, and it may not sound like there's much of a difference in words, but in practice they're actually very different principles. Freedom of religion is the freedom for people to be able to adopt a faith and to choose their freedom and to be free to practice it with themselves or with other people in other communities. Religious freedom is the basis in which people are actually able to use their religion as the basis to licence behaviour beyond worship. And that always interacts with law, and that always interacts with the rights and freedoms of others, and that's a very nuanced, difficult balancing approach that should be done in a measured, a proportionate and reasoned way amongst legislators.
How should it actually operate for schools as well, just when they're going through this process? So if they do have this right to refuse students based on their sexuality, do they ask them up front? Is it a questionnaire? How should that be canvassed?
Well, in practice, it just doesn't occur, or if it occurs, it's normally an extreme exception to the rule. I'm aware of one example in Australia in recent years. And the truth is, schools shouldn't do it. and I'm quite strong about the fact that schools shouldn't do it because when you come to children, different principles apply. I think when you're talking about adults, then obviously there's a much more complex interaction between people's rights and freedoms. But children, the job of schools should be to educate, to be able to protect children from situations where they face adverse consequences for factors, whether it's within their control or not within their control. So in practice, it doesn't happen very often, if at all. And that's why I say everyone should take a chill pill, recognise what the current law is, but also recognise what actually practically happens.
Right, but schools shouldn't do it, or would you go further and say schools shouldn't have the right to do that?
Well, schools shouldn't engage in these sorts of things. Now, let's wait and see what comes out of this report, and let's wait and see what the government's response is. But what we do know is that the report has been authored or co-authored by the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Rosalind Croucher, and I'm waiting to see what her proposals, as well as those of the other committee members, is to the government.
But do you think schools should have the right to say or ask a student what their sexuality is before deciding whether to accept them?
I don't think schools should do that in practice at all, and I don't think they do that in practice at all. And as I've said, if people have proposals to amend the law, I look forward to reading them, considering them properly, and to make sure that we make informed decisions rather than inflame this debate. Because actually, the truth is, Tom, it's actually causing a lot of people anxiety when I see what are, frankly, at times misleading front headlines on the Sydney Morning Herald or Fairfax Press today. A lot of people feel anxiety. A lot of people think that a new law is being introduced. It is not. And we actually need to soften the discussion, actually focus on what is being considered and what is proposed in a fair, informed and proportionate way.
Well, that's obviously part of what we're doing, but just again on that point of whether schools should have that right, Tim Wilson, to ask a student about their sexuality.
Well, I mean, schools are entitled to ask any questions as part of a practice around hiring people, whether it goes to whether they should actually do anything about it. I mean, I think the idea, frankly, of asking a child about their sexual orientation is fanciful and ridiculous. And again, I'm not aware of any school that's actually done that. But, you know, I don't know there isn't actually a law around this. This is where there's a misunderstanding again. I don't think there's any law saying that they're able to ask or not ask people about this type of information. It's where they're obliged to accept people.
Right, so
Tom, let me just finish off one final point, which is my understanding of what's in the paper today is that one of the things that schools won't be able to do is be able to deny access to education to any child who's already enrolled at a school. So it seems like, if anything, those loopholes are actually proposed to be closed by what's recommended in this report.
All right, well, we might be both flying a little bit blind. We'll see on the, I suppose, perhaps a follow-up on the right for schools to do that. What about when you're talking about hiring a teacher? An example of for example, a religious school, and that teacher has campaigned or supported same-sex marriage. It might be on their Facebook. A lot of people, you know, campaign or supported it publicly, but still say, well, I'm religious, so I would like to be hired by this school. Should the school be able to say, well, no, we don't want you here because you campaigned for same-sex marriage?
Well, again, based on what's in the reports today, what it seems to suggest is that so long as people conform to the doctrines and tenets of their faith within the practicing of their duties as an employee, then there shouldn't be an issue. And of course, people should have the freedom to be able to express their views. But why anybody would go and work in an organisation designed for a faith-based purpose to prosecute the values of that faith-based activity while also running contrary to those propositions, to me, kind of absurd. And this is part of the problem, is everybody's applying these secular standards around faith-based organisations and how they should operate. And so the task of us is, how do we design laws to find the complex, the difficult, the narrow definitions in law to make sure that we get the right outcomes for the Australian people, but critically to protect children, to make sure that faith-based people are able to organise schools and organisations on the basis of their values to pass them on to the next generation, which, by the way, is actually part of the human rights framework as well as part of their freedom of association.
I suppose just with that mix, though, of secular and religious schools, Tim Wilson, one option example I'll give to you, Melton Christian College, it has an open enrolment policy. So obviously it's a Christian college where other people can attend, and VCAT found that for that reason it had to allow a Sikh student to wear a patka when it went to VCAT. So if you expand that to employees, for example, is there a difference between a faith-based school that isn't open enrolment and one that is, and the rights that would go with it?
Well, that's their policy, and I'm not familiar with that case because, if I understand correctly, that's under Victorian state law. I'm talking about federal law, and there is a difference between. But when you have an open enrolment policy, yes, I mean, if you're not going to... I mean, this is sort of the irony, is one of the provisions under federal law, you can discriminate on the basis of certain things. Religion is not one of them. So, you know, Catholics can go work at Jewish schools and the like. And so when you have an open enrolments policy and you accept people regardless of their faith background, then yes, it seems logical that you would say that a component of that is that they are able to at least express their faith in their activities.
All right, I know you've got a busy time coming up grilling the executives of the big four banks, and well, we ran out of time for that today, but we'll be keeping an eye on that, as it should be interesting as your new role as the head of the House Economics Committee. Tim Wilson, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.